Welcome everybody to the inaugural Summer Science Talk hosted by the Extinction Rebellion Science Rebels. Today we have Samuel Muñoz. He's a assistant professor at Northeastern University Marine Science Center. He specializes in geology and other surfacial processes and such. Today he'll be talking to us about riverine floods in a changing environment, as well as a lot of other minutia into the science that goes into that. We're very lucky to have him. He's worked at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute as a postdoc, and he has also at this point elevated himself to a full track professor. He has papers in Nature and other major publications relating to the engineering and over-engineering of the Mississippi River. He is currently operating in Boston, Massachusetts, and and the host of all sorts of those kind of sciences and stuff like that. Let's see. And also in terms of that, he is kind of like the go-to guy in terms of understanding extreme events, humans kind of role that they play, and also in these extreme events as we respond to them, as well as kind of the more minutia with the modeling and stuff like that about how we can better understand these kind of systems. As you can see in the PowerPoint right here, in the chat, just an icebreaker for everybody. Put in your name, your pronouns, where you're located, and any information you want to share as well. Next slide. So just for more information on just kind of who the Extinction Rebellion Science members are, we're kind of a new group, more or less, here at Extinction Rebellion, a CAG that was recently formed. We're pretty much focused on outreach events related to science in the New York area, mainly Manhattan. We also provide scientific resources and references to Extinction Rebellion members who want to learn more about how they can help out, and also how they can be accurate with their activism as well. And also, and most recently, we now also coordinate talks with scientists. The first being Samel Muñoz, as you can see here, indicated by the golden arrow right here. And then next slide.
Okay.
All right, and everyone give it up for Samuel Muñoz.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dan, for the introduction. That look okay, everyone?
I can see.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Great. So thank you for inviting me and for the nice introduction. So my talk today is all about flooding that occurs mostly along rivers, although I'll sort of contrast that with floods that happen along coasts in the context of climate change. And I'll tell you up front sort of the main point I want you to take away from this talk, and then I'll get into it. The main point I really want you to take away from all this is that when we think about flooding along rivers and climate change, rivers are crazy sensitive to climate change. Even little changes in climate end up generating big changes in the behavior of a river and in terms of flood risk. And so that is concerning when we think about climate change and the fact that we depend on rivers so much, right? We live near them, we farm near them, we use them for transport, for trade. We have industry along them, cities along them, and all of that depends on those rivers behaving a certain way. But if they start to change a lot, then that's concerning. And so one thing you'll see is that, essentially, the more we mitigate emissions, the less the rivers will change. And that's probably a good thing. But then there's this other side that I'll get into too, which is less about the climate and more just about how we manage rivers on the ground and how we sort of live next to them and how we interact with them. And that's sort of another way that we can potentially mitigate some of the changes that are sort of happening now and will continue to happen over the coming decades. So that's kind of the takeaway of the talk, and hopefully that'll make more sense as I sort of walk through the rest of it. All right, so let's start with a very basic question. We're going to talk about floods. We should probably define what floods are. So what is flooding? In the very simplest sense, it's just water or inundation where we don't want water to be, right? Or where we don't expect water to be. That's the most basic definition of what a flood is. If we look at, on the right here, this is a chart showing all kinds of natural disasters and how their occurrence over time. So the y-axis here is just the number of natural disasters in the world, and the x-axis is time, so from 1970 up to 2018. And so the general trend here is that natural disasters have been increasing. But what's kind of striking about it is how the dark blue, those are all floods, right? And this increase in natural disasters that we're seeing is largely driven by this increase in floods and also other kinds of extreme weather. And so flooding is, a hazard that we deal with regularly and that we're increasingly dealing with. And part of that has to do with climate change. And part of it, as I was kind of alluding to, has to do with just the fact that has to do with our relationship with rivers and the fact that we choose to live next to them in places that are sort of inherently hazardous, and in some cases are becoming more hazardous because of climate change. When this chart, it just kind of groups all floods together, but I think it's important for us to distinguish between different types of floods, different types of flooding. And I'm going to break them up here into two main groups. And I'll talk mostly about one of them, but I'll give you a little bit about the other one. So the two main groups I've broken them up here into are coastal flooding and riverine flooding. That's how we're going to break them up. When I talk about coastal flooding, what I mean is water from the ocean, right, literally getting pushed up onto land. And that happens during a big storm like a hurricane or a nor'easter, when there's a lot of wind offshore, and that strong wind literally just pushes the ocean up onshore. That's very different than riverine flooding, which is mostly what I'm going to talk about today. Riverine flooding is coming from upstream, is a river, somewhere upstream, somewhere on land, having a lot of water coming into it, either from a lot of precipitation or a lot of snowmelt, and moving downstream. And there are lots of other factors that can complicate that, and I'll get into that more too. But for instance, the land use within a certain area can really influence when that precipitation falls, what that water does. If you have a lot of urbanization, if it's in a city and you have a lot of roofs and asphalt, that water is just going to move really quickly towards rivers and streams. But if it's an agricultural field or a forest, it's going to move a lot more slowly. So the land use that we have can also affect riverine flooding. So just to sort of illustrate some of the examples of these different kinds of floods. So when we think about coastal floods, some that I'm sure people in this group are probably familiar with Superstorm Sandy in 2012 that inundated much of New York and much of the eastern seaboard. This was a hurricane that transitioned into a sort of an extratropical system, basically a hurricane, and it hit New York at high tide, right? And so that strong wind just pushed water inland and caused seawater to rush into the streets of New York. Similarly, Hurricane Katrina a few years earlier makes landfall near New Orleans, and similarly just pushes seawater inland and causes much of the city to be flooded. Both of these events cost tens of billions of dollars, and were just a major headache and major inconvenience for millions and millions of people. Let's contrast that again with riverine floods. I'll give you some examples of those, and I'll give you two examples that occurred just in the last few months that I heard about these on the news just this summer. So in central China, just last month, I think in July, they got basically a year's worth of rain in a couple of weeks. And so everything flooded. And similarly, recently, there were lots of headlines about flooding in Western Europe, especially in Germany and the Netherlands and Belgium. And again, that was just an excessive amount of rainfall occurring over a short period of time, and causing rivers to swell, and that water moves downstream and causes flooding and lots of destruction. And again, all these events, super expensive, super inconvenient. They destroy homes, they disrupt trade, they ruin agricultural crops, and they're just generally very expensive and bad. They're bad. All right. So when we think about how these different kinds of floods are influenced by climate change, you kind of have to think about them differently, right? Because these two types are different. Coastal flooding is about literally the sea rushing inland, and when we think about coastal flooding and climate change, it's actually a fairly straightforward thing to think through, right? We have a lot of evidence that sea level is rising. I'm sure people in this room know that. And that sea level is going to continue to rise over the next century and beyond, directly in response to climate change. And so just over the last century or so, we've seen it rise. And we can already see that effect in places, really low-lying places, including New York, but maybe most famously in Florida, when places like Miami Beach today, just during high tide, the streets will start to flood. And they call this sunny day flooding. And this is just, it's high tide, and they built the street and the city to accommodate, what was high tide, but now high tide is just that much higher, just a few inches, right? But just that few inches means that now at high tide, some of these places are flooded, and they're already having to spend a lot of money to try and retrofit their infrastructure to deal with that. And when we look ahead to the next century, we're expecting that under any emission scenario, even if we really drastically reduce emissions now, there's enough sort of momentum in the system that sea level will continue to rise, even if we drastically reduce emissions a little bit. And if we do nothing, potentially a lot. And this will continue to just do the same thing, right? Any kind of high tide, or if you add a storm on top of that, the inundation is going to be that much worse based on just that sort of mean increase in sea level. And here's just if you want to play around, you might have played around with this already, but NOAA has this really cool sea level rise viewer, which is just a little web app you can play with. And you can, zoom into your city. I'm zoomed in here to Boston because that's where I live. And you can play with different water elevations to see sort of what gets inundated. So here's Boston during, this would be with a meter of sea level rise, say, and then like a nor'easter. So this could be, under a really high emission scenario plus a storm at the end of the century, what gets inundated in Boston, some of the financial district, pretty much all of Back Bay where my university is, a lot of Cambridge and Somerville would get inundated if we did nothing else, right? In that case, you can play around with this if you want in New York. I'm using Boston, one, because I live here, and two, because it's a little more dramatic than the one in New York, which isn't quite as bad as Boston in terms of low-lying infrastructure. But I digress. All right. So I hope I've made the point that that coastal flooding and climate change is a fairly straightforward relationship, right? Like the climate warms, the ocean warms, it causes sea level to rise. Ice sheets melt, glaciers melt, causes sea level to rise, and that just makes coastal flooding worse, essentially everywhere. But when we think about floods on rivers, it's actually a lot more complicated. And so to illustrate that, I pulled out this figure from a paper that came out a few years ago that was looking at how flood risk was going to change by the end of the century under sort of a moderate emissions scenario. And so here's a map of the world. Everything in blue is saying where we think flooding along rivers will increase. And everything in red is where we think flooding along rivers will decrease. Right, so right away you can see this is more complicated than coastal flooding. Coastal flooding is just like kind of bad news everywhere, right? But rivers, it's this really big mishmash. So you have areas along the equator, what we call the tropics, right? Pretty much generally flooding will increase. But when you go outside of the tropics towards the north and south, in what we call the extratropics, it's really this sort of mixed bag, right? There's a lot of reds and blues, and it's kind of mottled. And not only that, not all the models agree in these extratropical regions about what's going to happen. Some models think, the Mississippi, for example, or the Rhine River, the flood risk will increase under climate change, but others think it'll decrease. There's just a lot of uncertainty when we get out to these regions, when we think about riverine flooding. And so why is it that it's so this riverine flooding is so much more complicated than coastal flooding? And it kind of brings us back to, if you ever learned about like the water cycle in I don't know, elementary school or high school or college or at some point, it really comes back to the water cycle. If you think about what a river is, a river just represents lots of water coming in and flowing downstream, but also some water going out, right? Water is always sort of moving around between being liquid and being gas and flowing to the ocean and, you know, doing the water cycle thing. And so if you think about a river, I've got all these different arrows showing sort of where water is coming and going. So the water feeding a river could be coming from precipitation and snowmelt, right? Some of that water from precipitation and snowmelt might be stored in the soil and it might really slowly move towards the river. Some of it might go down into the groundwater and eventually feed the river. Some of the water is just flowing through the river and going towards the sea. And then some of the water is just evaporating out into the atmosphere. And it's basically being lost, right? And so there's this constant balance between all these different inputs and outputs. And that's what makes these projections kind of complicated, because it's not as simple as just, you know, in the case of coastal flooding, sea levels rising and thus it's worse everywhere. In this case, it's this sort of balance of, well, how does climate change affect all these different pieces? And as you'll see, climate change affects these different pieces differently, and in different parts of the world, it might do so differently. Right, so if I could just summarize those little pieces and those different aspects and think about how climate change affects them, you can kind of see how, you know, in a warmer atmosphere, so in a warmer world, we'll say, you're going to have more evaporation. That's just because there's more energy to evaporate water. But in a warmer atmosphere, you're also going to have more precipitation, right? Because a warmer atmosphere can hold more water in it. That's this relationship that's plotted out here, which is showing this sort of exponential relationship between temperature of the air and the amount of water that can go in it. This is something that, you know, when I teach climatology, is always sort of like one of the first principles that when we talk about water in the atmosphere, this is one of the first things we talk about, how a warmer atmosphere can hold more water than a colder atmosphere. And so if you warm the atmosphere as from climate change, you're just going to be able to hold more water in that air, and thus you're going to have more precipitation as well. And then the other term that's important here is snowmelt. So in regions where snow is important to feed a river, right? When snow melts, it flows and goes into the river. In a warmer world, we're generally going to have less snow. And so in places where in rivers that are really dependent on snowmelt, then flow might go down in a warmer world. But that depends. Maybe the contribution from snowmelt would go down, but maybe the contribution from precipitation would go up. And so you can have all these really sort of messed up, complicated situations. And that's why it's so difficult to understand how climate change is going to affect rivers. And so now I'm going to transition from sort of talking about, let's say, like background information to showing you how me and some of my collaborators have been trying to work to sort of unwrap this puzzle. It's not a very good analogy, but unwrap this challenge, right? Deal with this challenge. And you'll see a lot of the work focuses on the Mississippi River. That's just because it's a big river here in the United States and it's really important. I'll talk a little bit more about that. So it's just a really good system to study to get our heads around for this. And so one of the ways we can try and wrap our heads around this to basically come to try and understand how rivers might respond to a warmer climate is to go back in time a little bit to another time where it was warmer. And so one time that we've been focusing on quite a bit is what we some call the medieval era, about 1,000 years ago. About 1,000 years ago, we know that this region in the central United States and in the Western US was pretty warm and pretty dry. And in some ways, kind of looks like the future that we're very quickly going into. So on the left, here's a plot that is kind of messy. Don't worry about all of it. But it's from a paper I wrote a couple years ago where we use this really cool new technique to look at how temperature changed in right here next to St. Louis, right in the sort of the middle of the Mississippi Basin. to look at how temperature changed over time. So we're looking at years, so years more or less today, or sort of 20th century, going back about 1500 years. And this red line is showing the change in temperature. And so you can see how there's this really warm period, about 1,000 years ago in this region. And then on the right, here's just a map of looking at essentially wet or dry soil at the same time. This is from another study using a different technique, and also showing that this period was really dry. And so that's a pretty good analogy for what this region's supposed to look like over the next few decades. And so we're kind of using it as a way to look at, well, how did the river respond? How did the Mississippi respond during this other warm, dry period? And so I'll spare you the details of exactly how we figure out what the river was doing 1,000 years ago. If you really want to geek out with me, I'm happy to explain it to you and geek out. But I'll just sort of skip right to the punch of this, which is that when we look at how the river behaved in this time 1,000 years ago, we think that the flow of the river went way down in this warmer climate. And so that's what this black line here is showing. Here's time on the x-axis, right? So 1,500 years ago to about present. And this black line is showing, relative the amount of flow going through the Mississippi. And so in this period, about 1,000 years ago, flow kind of dips way down and then it comes back up. We also asked a climate model called the Community Earth System Model, what it thought the Mississippi River was doing. And it also showed the same thing, that it thought that in this warmer period, this is what the temperature is in red, this warmer period, that the flow went way down and then it sort of increased more towards present. And so this period that was a little bit warmer than, let's say the mid 20th century, about 1,000 years ago, the Mississippi's flow went down, which was pretty interesting to see. And then we could also ask the same model, why did the flow go down? And the answer comes back to thinking about all of these ins and outs, right? And so in the case of the Mississippi, it would seem, at least according to this climate model, that the culprit here is evaporation, that it was warmer 1,000 years ago. And so that thirstier atmosphere was able to evaporate more water, and that causes flow to go down at this time, which is pretty cool. It also shows us that even this little moderate change in climate, right? This period 1,000 years ago is nothing compared to what we're going to deal with over the next few decades. So there's even just this small, really moderate change in climate produces this really noticeable shift in the hydrology of the Mississippi, which is pretty cool. It also is cool because what we observe, or what we reconstructed in the black line, matches so well with what the model shows, which is also telling us that this model that we're using, CESM, this is a climate model, is like not terrible, which is great news, because a lot of the time we're pretty skeptical of a model's ability to reconstruct this kind of stuff, especially 1,000 years ago. So that was cool. And so then, because now we felt reasonably confident in this model's ability to tell us about how the Mississippi would change over time in response to warming, we then asked it what it thought about the future, right? What does it think the Mississippi is going to do over the next century or so? And we asked it, what do you think the Mississippi is going to do in a high emission scenario? So in like a Exxon, party mode, let's not mitigate at all, versus a more sort of, let's moderate some of our emissions. What do you think is going to happen? And that's what this plot is showing. So the sort of green and purple lines are showing sort of historical flows. And then the red line is showing what happens to the Mississippi's sort of, let's say, floodiness during a high emission scenario. So if we do not mitigate carbon at all, versus the blue one, whereas if we do some mitigation, right? So what is it showing? It's showing that if we do some mitigation, things don't change too much. But if we do no mitigation, the flow of the Mississippi increases like crazy, right? And the sort of flood risk along the Mississippi increases like crazy, which is not a good thing. It's not a good thing because the Mississippi, like so many big rivers, big important rivers in the world, are very engineered, and they're engineered within certain specifications to tolerate a certain flow. They were designed based on in this case and in lots of cases, what the 20th century looked like and what the 20th century climate looked like. And if you drastically increase or decrease, in this case, increase, the flow in the 21st century, the existing infrastructure won't be able to hold that. And that could be really catastrophic. That would mean you would have levees breaching all over the place, flooding lots of areas where people live, where people farm. It could even cause the whole channel of the Mississippi to change course and essentially bypass New Orleans and the port of South Louisiana and kind of leave New Orleans without a reason for even being there. Could potentially be completely catastrophic. So we really don't want that to happen. We looked specifically at this, the maximum flow that the Mississippi and like any river is designed to tolerate when it's been engineered like this is sometimes called the design flood. On the Mississippi, they call it the project design flood. And so we look specifically at the project design flood and the likelihood that it could be exceeded under these different emission scenarios. And that's what these plots are showing. They're kind of complicated and technical. It's the kind of thing that engineers look at. But what we'll just focus on here is the plot on the right. And this blue line, this dashed black line is showing the sort of level of the project design flood. So essentially like, do not cross that line. And you can see that, today in 2010 on the x-axis, more or less today, 2020, I guess, we're nowhere near at any risk of crossing that line. It's a really, they've set the bar very high. The capacity of the system is very high. But as we move along over the 21st century, and especially under the high emission scenario, by the time we get to the end of the 21st century, the likelihood of starting to exceed that project design flood starts to become within the realm of possibility, which is not a good thing, right? Because if we exceed that, it would really be catastrophic. Again, right now, this is what the lower Mississippi looks like today. It's full of barge traffic. There's levees that are lining the sides. People live and farm just outside the river. We have cities, all kinds of infrastructure. And if you exceed the capacity of those levees to hold that, then all of that floods and all the shipping gets disrupted, and it would cost an unimaginable amount of money. So that's my spiel about the effect of climate change on rivers, and you can kind of see here how the emissions scenario, whether or not we mitigate carbon emissions, matters a lot. If we do some mitigation, we don't enter this potential catastrophic future in terms of river flooding. But if we don't, then things could get really expensive and bad fast. The last thing, sort of riffing off that and how managed a lot of these big rivers are in the world, I want to just make the final point of how important our management of these rivers matters too, and this is really sort of independent of climate. So when we look at, again, a river like the Mississippi, here's just a satellite image of what the Mississippi looks like when it's flooding. Here's where the channel normally is, and all this sort of brown spilling out is during a flood. But you can see there's this line that's sort of like, I don't know what the word would be, but it's sort of like holding those floodwaters back, right? That line is a levee. It's basically a big earthen hill that engineers have built, and those big earthen hills, those levees, line the entire Mississippi River and essentially keep it from spilling out and flooding everything. It sort of keeps the flow really concentrated near the channel. And we've done that because people wanted to live near the river so they could, use it for shipping, and because the land near the river is really rich and really good for agriculture. And so we've made all kinds of changes to the river to essentially facilitate economic activity. But as I'll show you in just a sec, a lot of those changes that we've made have come at a cost as well. So I want to introduce the term here of what's called a floodplain, which you maybe have heard before, but in case you haven't, rivers, especially sort of the as they get downstream, so not way up in mountains, but as they move downstream, they have what we call a floodplain, which is this sort of low, flat area on either side of the river channel. And that floodplain is meant to flood, like every couple years, the river in a natural river system would rise up and then spill out onto its floodplain. But what we've done in a lot of river systems is build these levees that, as I said, they're these sort of earthen walls that line the river. So here's a picture of the levee. Here's a picture of the levee along the Mississippi, sort of lining it, right? Another thing that we did, and we often do to rivers, is we straighten them. So here on the right, here's looking at a section of the Mississippi in 1933, and you can see it's really curvy, right? And then in the 1940s and 50s, they cut all those curves off, and now it looks more like this. And they cut the curves off to make shipping and navigation easier, and also because they thought that it might help with flood control, flood mitigation. I think they were wrong about that, but it's what they thought at the time. And so one interesting thing about all these changes was people argue about, what kind of effect that had on flood risk. And so one thing that I wanted to do was really test that idea. What kind of effect do these changes have on flood risk? And it was kind of hard to answer that question by just looking at sort of what people written down about the river and river flow over the last 100 years or so. And so we actually used this really kind of cool geologic technique where we went out to lakes along the Mississippi and we stuck these giant tubes in the bottom of those lakes and took sediment cores and used those sediment cores to tell us about how flooding along the Mississippi had changed over the last few hundred years. We drove this boat from Massachusetts all the way to Mississippi and Louisiana. It was kind of insane, but pretty fun also. All right. And so what did we see when we looked at 500 years of Mississippi flow? It was pretty interesting. So here on the x-axis, this is some of the results from that study. The x-axis is time, so we're looking 500 years ago to more or less present. And on the y-axis is just the flow of different floods that we saw, right? And so this red line is showing us what the biggest flood that we observed in a sort of a moving 100-year period was over that 500-year time. And we also calculated, yeah, I'll leave it at that. So that's what we observed. And then we also looked at a model and we asked what happens if we ask what those floods would look like in a world where it was only driven by climate, right? There's no management of the river, no people building levees, none of that. And that's what this blue line is showing. And so you can see there's this big discrepancy over the 20th century between the red line and the blue line, right? They kind of track each other pretty well until the 20th century when they sharply diverge. And what we argued was that this difference here, this big increase that we've seen over the last century in how much flooding is going on in the Mississippi was mostly just due to all that work the engineers did to build levees and to do all these cutoffs. Because what those changes ultimately do is constrict the flow of the river. They don't let it spill out onto its floodplain and sort of flow more slowly out. They constrict the flow so the floods that you do get are bigger than they would otherwise be. And so you can almost think about this instead of like river management, it's almost like river mismanagement, right? We really wanted to use this land, but in managing it in this way, we've made it so that the river is flooding more than it would have if we just left it alone, right? And so in this case, this river management technique actually increased flood risk. But there are other techniques that are out there that don't do this. And so one solution that they've come up with in Holland, for instance, is to actually set these levees back a little bit further and to, in their words, make room for the river. And when you do that, when you essentially sacrifice a little bit of space for the river to do what rivers want to do, then suddenly it becomes less of a risk to people. And so part of this challenge is going to be reimagining our relationship with rivers and floodplains and sort of low-lying areas, and really thinking about, you know, what we value more, and how much we're willing to give nature space to do what it wants to do. All right, so I think I probably talked for enough, and hopefully you guys have some questions, and I'm really happy to answer them. I'll just sort of, you know, with concluding thoughts, or with sort of to wrap up what I wanted to say, summarize what I said. I'll say that, you know, the first point that I hope you took away from this was how sensitive flooding along rivers is to climate change, right? And so it's really, really important from a lot of different hazards and a lot of different perspectives for sort of climate change goes, but also from the perspective of rivers, that we mitigate emissions, right? And that's what this chart, I think, shows really clearly. If we take the don't mitigate path, the red path, then that could really be catastrophic or very expensive. And if we do some mitigation, we take the sort of blue path, and things don't get we don't change the river quite as much. And then the second point is less about climate, but it's also about our relationship to the environment. And it's just this idea that, you know, if mitigating emissions is this sort of global or national problem, there's also this sort of more local side to this, which is sort of locally and regionally how we interact with and manage river systems. And there's a lot of room in there to change the way we manage rivers and live alongside them. That will mean we're putting ourselves at less risk for flooding when they do occur inevitably. So that gives us a little bit of wiggle room in terms of adaptation for climate change. It's just sort of reimagining the way we manage and live alongside these rivers. All right, so with that, I'll just say thanks to all these people who have helped with this work, and I hopefully didn't forget anybody. A lot of people have helped, and as well as the National Science Foundation that's funded quite a bit of this work. And with that, I'm really happy to pass it back to Dan, and take any questions you guys have.
Well,
thanks.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. Let's see. For my questions, so let's check Pigeonhole first, I guess. I'll just like toss them out to you on Pigeonhole. You don't have to worry about going back and forth. Okay, so this one is from Anonymous. They asked, can you talk a little bit more about how you collect temperature and soil moisture data from centuries ago?
Yeah, okay, yeah, great. So that's a whole field called paleoclimatology, and it really just focuses on trying to understand climate from periods before we had people measuring climate. And so there's a lot of different ways we can do that. So for instance, the soil moisture thing, that's from people using tree rings. And so if you think about trees put on annual growth rings, right? If you ever cut open a tree, you can see little annual rings. You probably counted them as a kid to figure out how old the tree was. There are people called dendrochronologists who study tree rings, and they use usually the width of those rings to tell them about sort of how happy that tree was in any given year. So if a tree ring year is really narrow, then that tree was probably stressed, so it's probably dry. And then if the next year is wide, the tree wasn't stressed and it was wet, right? And so they can use that to essentially figure out soil moisture every year going back a couple thousand years, which is pretty cool. The other thing that I showed, which was from my study, that was actually a sediment core. So we went to a lake and stuck a pipe down the bottom of the lake and use that as another sort of record, right? Because the bottom of the lake, stuff's accumulating all the time. So the top of that sediment core is today, and as you go down, you're going back in time. And in that case, we were looking essentially at an organic molecule that's left behind by a bacteria. And the nature of that organic molecule is sensitive to the temperature that that bacterium was living in. And so when we look at all of that, we can infer what the temperature was in the past. It's crazy, but that's that whole field, that's what we do. if you want to learn more about it, I can give you, what's the word I'm looking for? Stuff to read or look at about that.
Fantastic. Okay, let's see what else we got. So what is the CESM?
Yeah, it's a climate model. We you guys think of as, you've probably heard the term climate model or an Earth system model. It's basically a lot of lines of computer code that try to describe Earth's climate. There is a bunch of these climate models in the world. Dan works with one of them that NASA runs. It's the NASA GISS model.
Yeah, ET1 model.
Yeah. CESM is another one that's run out of the National Center for Atmospheric Research at CU Boulder. And there's, I don't know, maybe a dozen climate models in the world. And those climate models are what form the basis for a lot of the IPCC work that's done. When they do projections of the future, it's based on these models. I don't know if that's a great explanation, but again, I could give you more material if you're interested in. There's actually, I was talking to Dan, Gavin Schmidt, who's a New Yorker, who works for NASA. Actually, I think now he works for Biden. But anyway, he used to work with the NASA GISS model, and he has a TED Talk. It's 10 minutes long, and he does a really great job of explaining climate models and how they're used and what they're all about. So if you just look up, like YouTube, like Gavin Schmidt TED, you'll find his talk. It's really great.
Fantastic. All right, and this one's for me, and it kind of flows in this one really well. I'm just curious of like, how are you able to kind of like predict like how what flooding would have been without the human intervention into the future? Like, you're comparing it kind of like the non-modified river discharge versus like the modified discharge.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
How do you
Yeah. So I didn't explain that super well because I didn't want to get into the super details, but basically a big part of that paper was also figuring out the relationship between climate variability, in this case, sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and the flow of the Mississippi. And so we found that there was a pretty strong statistical relationship between basically like how warm or cool the oceans were and the flow of the Mississippi. And so then we can take what we know the oceans were doing at that time and take that relationship and apply it going forward to kind of say like what the flow should have been if only the oceans were controlling the flow, and then contrast that to what we observe, which is not that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Fantastic. All right, thanks, man. Let's see, what else? Do you have anything else here? Let's see. Oh, yeah, here we go. This one's from Jennifer. She said, what is your reaction to the most recent IPCC report?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of the people who wrote it, and I'm kind of in a bubble, right? Because it's literally what I do. But I think it's a really great, they've made a lot of improvements from the last one. There's a lot of fanfare about these when they come out. I mean, on the one hand, I think I'm really proud of the people who worked on it. I think it's a great report. On the other hand, like, I don't know what the value is anymore. Like, are we really convincing anybody else with these reports, or is everybody who's on board that this is like a real problem already on board? I don't know. I struggle with that a little bit. I also struggle with the idea that like we need to rewrite this report the last one was 2013. So like every 7 years. We have to rewrite the report from scratch every 7 years. Feels kind of like an old school mentality, instead of like make it like a Wikipedia article that can just be updated all the time instead of just rewriting from scratch all the time. That feels a little bit like an encyclopedia almost. But I also understand that it's like a political document almost, and then it needs to be ratified by the UN. And so I think it would be more complicated if it was just like updated online all the time. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. I have mixed feelings about it, I guess. I think from a science perspective, it's awesome. I think the authors did a great job. I don't know. I kind of question the value a little bit, but maybe it's good to just get climate change like in the news for a couple of days and then and then the average person forgets about it again, until the next disaster.
The cycle. Okay, cool. I think that's all of our questions. Should we leave would you find leaving an email or something in case anyone's shy and wants to ask something later?
Yeah, that's fine. I can put it in the chat?
Yeah.
I got an email from somebody that I didn't respond to. I'm sorry. They were, I think, British, and they were gonna try and stay up really late. Which, if they made it, I appreciate that.
True.
Yeah.
Okay. And can I ask briefly too, like, what's your thoughts on how we deal with mitigating emissions? How do we stop the Exxon party?
Yeah, I'm the wrong person to ask. I hate to sort of cop out. I don't know. I really don't know how we stop the Exxon party. I mean, I think in some ways the Exxon party is starting to stop, but it feels bigger than one person or one group. It feels like, and I don't know what, it feels like this sort of massive just movement of humanity towards an outcome, and it feels really difficult to control. So I don't know. I mean, I think, so the sort of the cop-out is like, vote for politicians that think this is real and will actually do something about it, which, like, okay, sure, but we've been doing that for a long time, and change is very slow, too slow, frankly. So yeah, I don't know. I frankly, I think a lot of people in this group probably have maybe better ideas about that than me.
Yeah, I think those are all the questions and such. Once again, I'd like to thank Sam a lot for us coming here and talking to us and stuff like that, and it's like, keeping us wired in what's going on at the fate of the rivers and what we can do.
A couple of minutes to kind of go through what's coming up. As we mentioned before, the Scientists Affinity Group has put together a series of talks that are really interesting with a lot of reputable scientists. One to note is next week, we will have a talk with Michael Mann, who is a climatologist and geophysicist, who has been featured on the news a lot lately with the recent extreme weather events and the increasing climate debate at the political level. Mike will be speaking about his new book called The New Climate War, which shows how fossil fuel companies have been, waging a war to deflect blame and responsibility over the last 30 years and have delayed action on climate and the steps that we can do to actually save the planet. So what I did also want to mention is we are calling on the public to take part in a mass action in New York City on September 17. It's really important that we mobilize this September to highlight how 2021 is a critical year for climate action, especially in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow in November. COP, which stands for the Conference of Parties, is a gathering of world governments to forge a global response on the climate emergency. So it's important that we take action to remind and demand those in power that we won't accept anything short of bold and radical action on the climate. So to kind of sign up for this is go to the URL, tinyurl.com/XRNYC917. We do make sure that our actions and our protests are inclusive and everybody is able to participate. So once you sign up and you look at the form, you can actually indicate your different levels of risk that you're willing to take, as well as the kind of roles that you would be interested in actually participating. We certainly welcome everyone. But to really carry out a mass action, we need everybody to be volunteering in this effort. So look forward to see more sign-ups after this call. And if we go to the next slide. So I also did want to share with the group, we do have a series of events coming up leading all the way up to September 17, which is our day of action. This Friday, we have a greenwashing ecocide action. And basically the rebels will be meeting at Grand Central at 7:45 in the morning to carry out an action in solidarity with the Indigenous-led resistance Stop Line 3. The Anishinaabe and Ojibwe people in Minnesota have been fighting against an expansion of the tar sands pipeline by the Canadian company Enbridge for years. If completed, the pipeline will be equivalent to 50 coal plants. That is not what we need today. And so, you know, in solidarity with all of these Line 3 activists who have been facing escalated violence and suppression through their work, what we can do here in New York City is put pressure on the banks that are funding these fossil fuel projects. A couple of other events coming up, nonviolent direct action. So if you are new to the movement, and you've never taken part in the action, it doesn't matter if you are a low-risk individual or high-risk individual, it is good to actually have training in nonviolent direct action. It is a very interesting course that will kind of explain to you what goes on during an action, the different roles that that people can take during action. So we do recommend that everyone actually takes this training once before participating in an action. We have a couple of other events. What I do want to highlight is we also have a community building event on August 22nd. That will be in Central Park. And the intention is that we are inviting all climate groups and activists to come meet with us and build community and build relationships as we, you know, continue fighting the fight, you know, in regards to the climate emergency. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. We do have different events, which includes art builds, heading for extinction talks, orientation calls as well too. If you're new to the movement, I do recommend that you take the orientation call. There will be an individual that will help explain what Extinction Rebellion is about, our demands, our principles, our DNA, and help you get connected within the movement and kind of find, you know, where your skill sets would best fit within the movement, because we need all people from all backgrounds and all kinds of professional backgrounds and interests to be involved in the movement.
I guess that's that for the agenda, folks. Thank you everyone for attending and coming. I appreciate it. This is our first event that we've had so far, and looks like the turnout's been pretty good. So yeah, awesome. Great. I hope everyone had a good time. If you have any questions, Sam left his email in the chat.